In 2003, a man trapped alone in a canyon made a decision most people can't even imagine. He cut off his own arm with a dull pocket knife to save his life. And he isn't even close to the most extreme survival story you're about to hear. This is the story of the humans who looked death directly in the face and refused to blink, and what it actually cost them to walk away. Survival instinct doesn't care about dignity, comfort, or what's normal. Stranded, starving, freezing, or trapped, human beings have done things that sound impossible until you realize real people actually did them. Some of these stories end in triumph. Some end in guilt that never fully goes away. We're counting up from the strange to the almost unthinkable, starting with a man who survived over 2 months in the Australian outback on frogs and grasshoppers. January 2006. Ricky McGee, a 35-year-old man, is driving through the remote Australian outback when, by his own account, he picks up a hitchhiker who drugs him. He wakes up disoriented in the bush with no vehicle, no supplies, and no idea exactly where he is, somewhere in the vast, sun-scorched Tanami Desert region of the Northern Territory. What follows is 71 days alone in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. McGee survives by eating frogs, grasshoppers, and leeches he pulls from a muddy waterhole, along with a lizard he manages to catch. He loses an estimated 48 kilograms, nearly half his original body weight, over the course of the ordeal, reduced to skin stretched over bone by the time cattle station workers finally spot him in July 2006, barely able to stand. Doctors who examined him afterward said his survival was remarkable given the extreme malnutrition and dehydration his body had endured. Some later cast doubt on parts of his account of how he ended up stranded in the first place, but the physical evidence of what his body went through during those 71 days was undeniable. Frogs and leeches got one man through 2 months in the desert. The next survival story isn't on land at all. It's adrift on open ocean, with literally nothing to eat but what the sea decides to give up. February 4, 1982. Solo sailor Stephen Callahan's small sloop, the Napoleon Solo, is struck by something in the middle of the night during a solo transatlantic crossing, likely a whale, and begins taking on water fast. Callahan barely escapes into a small inflatable life raft before his boat sinks, with only a handful of emergency supplies. Some flares, a spear gun, a few pints of water, and a solar still to convert seawater into fresh water. For 76 days, Callahan drifts roughly 1,800 nautical miles across the Atlantic. He spears fish that gather beneath the raft's shade, eats raw dorado and triggerfish, and even manages to catch birds that land on the raft looking for a place to rest. His homemade solar still barely keeps him alive, producing just enough drinkable water to avoid dying of thirst, drop by agonizing drop. 6 separate ships pass within visual range during his ordeal. None of them see him. He's eventually spotted by fishermen near Guadeloupe in the Caribbean on April 21, 1982, weighing roughly 29 kilograms less than when he started, down to just muscle, sunburned skin, and saltwater sores covering nearly his entire body. One man survived on frogs in the desert, another on raw fish adrift at sea. Both were alone. The next case is almost the same ordeal, except it happened 40 years earlier, during a war, and it lasted nearly twice as long. November 23, 1942. Poon Lim, a 24-year-old Chinese sailor working as a steward aboard the British merchant ship SS Ben Lomond, is at sea in the South Atlantic when a German U-boat torpedoes the vessel. The ship sinks in minutes. Lim manages to find a life jacket and, later, a small wooden life raft stocked with a modest emergency supply of biscuits, chocolate, sugar lumps, and a few flares, but no other survivors. He rations the supplies to stretch as long as physically possible, then improvises. He unravels rope from the raft to fashion crude fishing lines and hooks made from bent nails salvaged from the raft structure, using shellfish stuck to the underside of the raft as bait. He catches rainwater in a canvas life jacket cover to drink, and at one point kills and drinks the blood of a small shark that attacked the raft, using its dried meat as emergency rations for the following days. He spots multiple ships and even a plane during the ordeal. Most pass without noticing him, and one alleged U.S. Navy aircraft crew reportedly assumed he was a decoy and moved on. On April 5, 1943, 133 days after the sinking, Brazilian fishermen finally spot him near the mouth of the Amazon River. He had lost significant weight but could still walk unassisted onto the boat that rescued him. His 133 days remains, to this day, one of the longest confirmed solo open ocean survival records in recorded history. 3 people. 3 different oceans and deserts. 3 different decades. All 3 survived using nothing but raw instinct and whatever the environment happened to offer. The next case takes us out of the water completely, into one of the most violent plane crashes anyone has ever walked away from, quite literally, from 2 miles up. December 24, 1971. 17-year-old Julianne Koch is flying with her mother over the Peruvian Amazon rainforest aboard Lancer Flight 508 when the plane flies directly into a severe thunderstorm. Lightning strikes one of the wings. The aircraft breaks apart mid-air at an altitude of roughly 3,200 meters, over 2 miles high. Julianne, still strapped into her seat, is thrown clear of the disintegrating fuselage and falls the entire distance to the jungle canopy below. An almost unthinkable fall that, by some accounts, was likely slowed just enough by the seat row acting like a crude parachute spin, or by falling into thick tree canopy that cushioned the final impact. She survives with a broken collarbone, a deep gash on one arm, and a severely injured eye, but she survives. Alone, injured, wearing only a torn mini dress and 1 sandal, she spends the next 11 days navigating through dense rainforest with almost no food. Following a small stream she remembers her father, a biologist, once telling her would eventually lead to people. She deliberately wades through the water despite the risk of piranhas and caimans, reasoning correctly that predators were less likely in moving current. On day 11, she finds a small boat, and shortly after, local lumber workers who nurse her back to health. Of the 92 people aboard the flight, she is the only survivor. Falling 2 miles and living is almost impossible to picture. But the next survivor didn't face nature by accident. She was sent into one of the most hostile environments on the planet completely unprepared, and abandoned there for 2 full years. September 1921. Ada Blackjack, a 23-year-old inupiate seamstress from Alaska, joins a small expedition attempting to claim Wrangel Island in the Arctic Ocean for Canada and Britain, taking the job purely because she desperately needed money to support her young son, who suffered from tuberculosis. She has no wilderness survival training and had never intended to be anything more than the expedition's seamstress and cook. By 1923, after supply ships failed to reach the remote island, 3 of the 4 men on the expedition set out across the frozen sea ice in a desperate attempt to reach Siberia for help, and are never seen again. The 4th man, already dying from scurvy, remains behind with Ada. She nurses him for months until his death, leaving her completely alone on the island with a sick cat for company. Over the following months, Ada, despite having no formal training, teaches herself to trap Arctic foxes, hunt birds, and successfully shoots a polar bear that approached her camp, using a rifle she'd only recently learned to fire competently. She survives entirely alone for nearly 2 additional months after the last man's death, until a rescue ship finally reaches Wrangel Island on August 20, 1923. When she returns home, tabloids sensationalize her ordeal, some even accusing her, without evidence, of causing the deaths of the men who left her behind, an accusation she spent years quietly living down. Ada survived isolation nobody trained her for. Our next case is the opposite. A man who was highly experienced, alone in a remote canyon, and made a decision almost nobody believes they could actually go through with. April 26, 2003. Experienced canyoneer Aaron Ralston is descending alone through Blue John Canyon in Utah when a boulder, roughly 360 kilograms, shifts and pins his right forearm against the canyon wall. He hadn't told anyone specifically where he was going. For the next 5 days, he rations a single burrito and less than a liter of water, chips uselessly at the boulder with a cheap multi-tool, and eventually resorts to drinking his own urine to stay alive. By day 5, dehydrated, hallucinating, and certain he was going to die pinned to that wall, Ralston came to a decision almost nobody believes they could go through with. He used the same dull multi-tool to break his own forearm bones by leveraging his body weight against the boulder, then spent roughly an hour severing the remaining muscle, tendon, and skin to amputate his own arm below the elbow. After freeing himself, still bleeding heavily, he rappelled roughly 20 meters down a canyon wall one-handed, then hiked several more miles before encountering hikers who alerted rescue services. He'd been trapped for 127 hours total. Ralston went on to become a public speaker and mountaineer, eventually summiting all of Colorado's 14,000-foot peaks, including several completed after the amputation, using a specially designed prosthetic ice axe attachment. Cutting off your own arm to survive sounds like the worst decision a person could ever be forced to make. It's not even the darkest one on this list, because our next case involves a man who survived alone by eating the animals that had kept him alive in the first place. November 1912. Australian geologist Douglas Mawson sets out with two companions, Belgrave Ninnis and Xavier Mertz, on a sled dog expedition across Antarctica's brutal interior as part of the Australasian Antarctic Expedition. In December, Ninnis and an entire sled team of dogs vanish without warning into a hidden crevasse, taking with them most of the group's food supplies and their tent. Mawson and Mertz, now stranded roughly 500 kilometers from base camp with dramatically inadequate food, are forced to kill and eat their remaining sled dogs one by one to survive, including feeding the dogs meat back to the surviving dogs to stretch supplies even further, a brutal but calculated bid to keep the expedition moving as long as possible. Unknown to either man at the time, dog liver contains extremely high concentrations of vitamin A, which is toxic to humans in large doses. Both men develop severe vitamin A poisoning. Their skin peels off in sheets, they suffer intense abdominal pain, and Mertz eventually dies from the condition on January 8, 1913. Mawson, alone, continues the trek solo, at one point falling into a crevasse himself, saved only because his sled jammed above him, allowing him to haul himself back out hand over hand using a rope. He finally reaches safety on February 8, 1913, arriving at base camp mere hours after the expedition's supply ship had already departed for the season, forcing him to spend an entire additional year in Antarctica before rescue. Mawson survived by eating the animals that had carried him. Our next case is one of the most famous ice survival stories ever recorded. An entire crew, stranded for over a year, who somehow all made it home. Sir Ernest Shackleton sets out to lead the first land crossing of Antarctica aboard his ship, the Endurance. The ship never even reaches the continent. It becomes trapped in pack ice in the Weddell Sea, slowly crushed over the following 10 months until it finally sinks in November 1915, leaving all 28 crew members stranded on drifting sea ice with only lifeboats and supplies they can carry. 4 months, the crew camps on shifting ice floes, eventually launching the lifeboats to reach the barren, uninhabited Elephant Island in April 1916, the first solid ground they'd stood on in nearly 500 days. Knowing rescue would never find them there, Shackleton and 5 handpicked men then undertake one of the most audacious rescue voyages in maritime history, sailing a 6.9-meter open lifeboat roughly 1,300 kilometers across some of the most violent seas on Earth to reach South Georgia Island. After 16 days at sea, they land on the wrong side of the island, forcing Shackleton and 2 others to cross previously unmapped, glacier-covered mountains on foot, with no climbing equipment beyond a carpenter's adze and rope, to reach a whaling station on the other side. Remarkably, every single one of the 28 original crew members survived the entire ordeal, one of the greatest survival records in exploration history, achieved through discipline, morale management, and Shackleton's refusal to accept a single death as acceptable. 28 men, 0 deaths, against odds that should have killed all of them. Our next case has a far darker outcome. Because these survivors didn't just risk death, several members ultimately chose to eat the dead to save the living. Spring 1846. A group of roughly 87 American pioneers, led in part by brothers Jacob and George Donner, set out for California using an untested shortcut route that promised to save time, a decision that instead cost the group weeks of delay through harsh desert terrain. By the time they reached the Sierra Nevada mountains in late October, an early and unusually severe snowstorm traps them at high elevation, far too late in the season to continue. Snowed in for months at what's now called Donner Lake, with supplies rapidly running out, the group first survives on boiled hides and even the leather from their own shoes and harnesses. As winter drags on and members begin dying of starvation and exposure, some survivors ultimately resort to eating the flesh of those who had already died, a decision made explicitly to keep the remaining living members, including children, alive long enough for rescue parties to reach them. Rescue parties reached the camp in stages beginning in February 1847, but by the time the last survivors are pulled out in April, only 48 of the original 87 members are still alive. The The story became one of the most infamous survival accounts in American history, not because cannibalism itself was unique to this case, but because it happened to American settlers, was extensively documented by later journalists and historians, and became permanently attached to the group's name in a way few other survival stories ever have. The Donner Party's story shaped how an entire country thinks about survival cannibalism for over 170 years. But it's not the most detailed, most personally documented account of that exact decision. That belongs to the final case on this list, one that happened in living memory, told directly by the survivors themselves. October 13, 1972. A chartered flight carrying 45 people, including members of an amateur Uruguayan rugby team, the Old Christians Club, along with friends and family, crashes into the Andes Mountains on the Argentina-Chile border after the crew misjudges their position in thick cloud cover. 12 people die instantly or within hours of the impact, at an altitude of roughly 3,500 meters, in freezing temperatures with almost no usable food on board. Rescue searches are called off after 8 days, a fact the survivors learn by picking up a small transistor radio's news broadcast. With no hope of outside help, and after what survivors have since described as an agonized, prayerful group discussion, the remaining passengers made a decision. They would eat the flesh of those who had already died, cutting it into small strips and drying it in the thin mountain air, in order to survive. Survivor Roberto Canessa later compared the decision explicitly to the Christian communion ritual, the idea that the dead were, in effect, giving their bodies to sustain the living, a framing that helped some of the survivors find peace with what they'd done. An avalanche on October 29 buries the wreckage further and kills 8 more people while they slept. Finally, after 61 days on the mountain, 2 of the strongest survivors, Nando Pardu and Roberto Canessa, set out on a desperate 10-day trek across the mountains with no climbing gear, surviving on the same preserved rations, eventually spotting a herdsman on horseback on the other side who alerts authorities. On December the 22nd and 23rd, 1972 to 72 days after the crash, helicopters finally reached the wreckage and rescue the remaining 14 survivors. Of the 45 original passengers, 16 walked off that mountain alive. Every person on this list crossed a line they never imagined crossing. A frog eaten raw, an arm severed with a dull blade, a friend's body used to keep the living breathing one more day. None of them call themselves heroes for it. They simply refused to let the moment they were in be the moment they died. If Aaron Ralston cutting off his own arm made your stomach drop, you need to see our next video, the rescues that arrived minutes too late. Which survival story on this list do you think you could actually go through with? And which one do you think would break you? Tell us honestly in the comments. We read every one.